The last words Michael heard his father speak were, "I'm proud of you, son." But for 37 years, those weren't the words he'd been waiting to hear. Sometimes redemption comes in the final breath, when all that's left is truth. This is the story of two words that almost came too late. We all carry wounds from the people who were supposed to love us unconditionally. Some scars fade with time, becoming distant memories we barely touch. Others remain fresh, bleeding into every relationship, every choice, every moment of self-doubt. Michael carried his wound like a stone in his chest, heavy, cold, and impossible to ignore. His father, David, was a man carved from granite and silence. Born in 1943, he belonged to a generation that believed emotions were weaknesses and apologies were admissions of failure. David worked double shifts at the steel mill, came home exhausted, and ruled his house with the same iron discipline he'd learned from his own father. Love, in David's world, was providing food and shelter. Affection was a luxury they couldn't afford. Michael grew up walking on eggshells, desperate for approval that never came. Every report card, every achievement, every small victory was met with a grunt, or, at best, "You could do better." When Michael was 12, he accidentally broke his father's favorite coffee mug, a chipped ceramic piece David had owned since his army days. The fury that followed wasn't just about the mug. It was about everything David couldn't say, couldn't feel, couldn't express. "You're worthless," he screamed. "Just like your mother said you'd be." The words hit harder than any physical blow could have. Michael's mother had left when he was 7, vanishing one Tuesday morning like smoke. For years, Michael wondered if she'd left because of him, if he was somehow broken, unlovable. Now his father, the one person left who was supposed to protect him, had confirmed his deepest fear years past. Michael excelled in school, earned a scholarship to college, became a successful architect. He married Sarah, a kind woman who saw through his armor of perfectionism to the wounded boy underneath. They had 2 children, Emma and Jake, and Michael swore he'd be different. He'd be the father he'd always needed. But generational trauma has long fingers, and sometimes the harder you run from becoming your parent, the more you mirror their patterns. When the children misbehaved, Michael's voice would rise with that familiar edge. When they broke something, he'd feel that old rage bubbling up. Sarah would watch him catch himself mid-sentence, see him physically step back from the precipice. "You're not him," she'd whisper during those moments. "You're not your father." But Michael never fully believed her. The wound was too deep, the scar tissue too thick. He tried therapy, meditation, even attempted to reconcile with David multiple times over the years. Each attempt ended the same way, with his father's defensive anger and his own retreat into cold silence. They were 2 broken men speaking different languages, neither knowing how to build a bridge across 30 years of hurt. David was 74 when the heart attack struck. Michael rushed to the hospital, finding his father smaller than he'd ever seen him, tubes and wires transforming the granite man into something fragile and human. For 3 days, they sat in that sterile room, surrounded by the steady beep of machines and the weight of everything unsaid. On the morning of the 3rd day, something shifted. David's eyes opened with unusual clarity, and for the first time, in decades, he really looked at his son, not through him, not past him, but directly into his eyes with a recognition that made Michael's breath catch. "Michael," David whispered, his voice paper-thin but steady. "I need to tell you something." Michael leaned closer, their faces inches apart. He could smell the antiseptic, hear the irregular rhythm of his father's heart on the monitor, feel the decades of hurt hanging between them like a curtain. "I was wrong," David continued, each word seeming to cost him tremendous effort. "About everything. About how I raised you. About what I said. About..." His voice cracked, tears forming in eyes that Michael had never seen cry. "About telling. That you were worthless. You were never worthless. You were the best thing I ever did, and I was too scared, too broken to see it. The heart monitor began to slow, its steady beat becoming irregular, labored. David's hand found Michael's, fingers trembling with the effort. "I'm sorry," David whispered, the words carrying the weight of 37 years. "I'm so sorry, son. I love you. I've always loved you. I never learned how to show it." 1 second later, the monitor flatlined. Michael sat frozen, his father's hand still warm in his own, those two words echoing in the sudden silence. "I'm sorry." 37 years of waiting, and they came with less than a second to spare. 1 breath later, and they would have died with David, taking any chance of healing with them. The funeral was small, quiet. Michael stood at the graveside, no longer the wounded boy seeking approval, but a man finally freed from a burden he'd carried his entire life. The apology hadn't erased the years of pain, but it had transformed them. Where once there had been a deep well of anger, now there was something else: understanding, perhaps even compassion. In the weeks that followed, Michael found himself changing in ways he hadn't expected. The sharp edge in his voice with Emma and Jake softened. When Jake accidentally broke a picture frame, Michael knelt down to his son's level, saw the fear in those young eyes, and said simply, "It's okay, buddy. Accidents happen. I love you." Sarah noticed the change immediately. "He set you free, didn't he?" she asked one evening as they watched their children play in the backyard. Michael nodded, unable to trust his voice. Freedom. That's exactly what it was. Freedom from the wound, from the weight, from the endless cycle of hurt, passing from father to son. Michael began to understand that his father's cruelty had never been about him. It had been about David's own wounds, his own broken places, that he'd never learned to heal. Hurt people, but sometimes, in those final moments, love finds a way to break through even the thickest armor. 6 months later, Michael stood in that same hospital, but this time in the maternity ward. His daughter Emma was giving birth to her first child, a son they planned to name David. As Michael held his grandson for the first time, he whispered the words his father had finally found the courage to say. "I love you. I will always love you. And I promise to show you every single day." The cycle was broken. 2 words, spoken 1 second before it was too late, had changed everything. Sometimes redemption arrives in whispers. Sometimes healing comes disguised as endings. And sometimes the words we've waited our entire lives to hear find us just when we thought it was too late to matter. But it's never too late for love to win. It's never too late for sorry to mean everything. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more stories that remind us of our shared humanity. And remember, it's never too late to say the words that matter. Until next time, hold the people you love a little closer.